Well, welcome to our Sunday school class. I don't know what day you're watching this or what time of the day you're watching it, but I'm glad that you are. Last week, Tommy was able to get us a good start on the divided nation. We will be talking in Kings for this study. The First and Second Kings tell about the division of the kingdom of Israel into the two nations and their trials and tribulations. Tommy got a good start on talking about the role of the prophets in providing for the word of God and the direction of the countries and the challenges that they faced in doing this. He introduced Elijah to us, and Elijah had made a very strong promise to King Ahab, who was king of the northern part, or the kingdom of Israel. And he told him that it would not rain in the country until God decided that it was time for it to rain. Now, King Ahab is known primarily for his apostasy and for his lack of adhering to the covenant that God had made with Israel. And he also was known for being the husband of Jezebel. And we know her history in worshiping idols. So Tommy set that up by saying that Elijah went into this den of wickedness, if you will, and made this promise to them that the nation would suffer because of their worship of idols. He also indicated that God prepared Elijah for this by sending him to the brook Kerith to be fed by the ravens and to drink the water from the brook, to sustain him as he gathered physical and emotional and spiritual energy to challenge King Ahab later down the road. He also went back up into the northern part of the area and there found a woman who gave her all, even though she was an idol worshiper, to help him prepare himself for the task ahead. She gave all the food that she had. She gave all the whole sustenance of her family's existence, really, for her and her son. And the Lord caused her son to perish. And she came to Elijah and asked if this was her payment for taking care of the prophet of God. She must have known something about God, or she wouldn't have known to serve Elijah, and she wouldn't have known to ask that kind of question. Elijah records the first resurrection of an individual from the dead that we have in the Bible. And by that, she knew that he had represented to her the true and only and living God. So that's the setup for where we are. That's where Tommy left off last week. And so we're going to begin today in chapter 18, which deals with Elijah some 3.5 years or so down the road. The drought has been significant. It's been prominent. The people are suffering. The famine is strong. King Ahab has been searching for Elijah everywhere, literally everywhere that he possibly could look. And so he is frustrated. He is afraid, actually, because in the scripture, if you read the verses in the first part of chapter 18, he didn't express sorrow for his worship of the idols. He didn't express sorrow for the way the famine had been affecting his people. He really was concerned about his animals, which tells us that he was concerned about his military presence and his military might in the face of other countries who might want to dominate that area. So we can tell that Ahab, even after 3.5 years of this drought, did not have any change of heart that was significant relative to the provision of God and God's provision for the people of Israel. Now, I want to take a little side trip here because I think it's significant, and we'll come back to this at the very end. In the first part of chapter 18, it says that Ahab went to Obadiah, a servant of his, a person of great counsel to the king, someone who was close to the king and probably had conversation with the king every day. And he asked him to go and to find a source of water and to find Elijah. And what is significant here is that Obadiah was in fact a believer. In fact, he had defied all authority of the king and the queen in hiding over 100 prophets in various locations, true believers in God. He did that at great risk to himself. Had he been discovered, he would have been put to death probably. He was even not only providing a place for them to hide, safe and secure from Jezebel and the prophets of Baal, but he also was feeding them probably out of the king's stores. So I think Obadiah is often overlooked in this part of the story, but he's a man of significance. He's a prophet of God himself. He actually took a high risk in hiding these prophets, and he did it in a very quiet way. And that makes me wonder what we do today as Christians in terms of representing God in the place where we find ourselves in our daily activities. Obadiah's mission was to teach people about God, but it was also to protect the prophets. What is our mission today? What are we to be doing in basically a pagan world that we live in? It doesn't matter what arena we address. The world is basically against God these days. And so how do we handle that? And how do we represent ourselves? And how do we go about telling other people about God and his ultimate salvation? I think it's just an interesting story that has a parallel for our lives today. So Obadiah, obedient servant of the king, at least in the matters of the kingdom, goes on a journey. He takes half the kingdom and is looking and searching for a source of water. He's actually, if he runs across Elijah, that would be an added blessing. And so what happens? He runs across Elijah. That's God intervening, because God was ready for Elijah to go and address King Ahab and tell him that the famine, or that the drought rather, was about to end. Now, Obadiah reacts in a strange sort of way when Elijah asks him to go and tell King Ahab that Elijah is coming to see him. Obadiah exhibits fear. Why would he do this? Well, it's because he knew that if he went and told the king that he had found Elijah and Elijah was coming to see the king, that the Lord had the power, certainly, if not the will, the desire, to hide Elijah again like he had for the last 3+ years. So Obadiah was a little bit hesitant of what the Lord might do and indirectly expose Obadiah before Ahab, who would probably take his life. But Obadiah's faith in God and faith in Elijah took precedent. And so Obadiah went to King Ahab and told him that Elijah was on his way to meet him, because Elijah had specifically said, "Today I will see King Ahab." So it's a matter of trust and faith. So here's Obadiah, a quiet Christian, doing a quiet ministry like most of us do in our daily lives, and yet having the courage to take a huge step when opportunity presented itself. I think it's an important story for us to learn from. Well, Elijah does go to meet King Ahab, and King Ahab meets him on the road, and it's not a very cordial greeting. In fact, he basically says, are you the one who's been persecuting Israel during this particular time? In fact, he calls him a troubler in verse 17 of the 18th chapter. Are you the troubler of Israel? Putting all the blame on Elijah and accepting no blame for his own actions, his own failure to worship the true God and continue in his idolatry worship. He took no responsibility for himself. And that's true even in today's society. We see people who have this same kind of attitude, the same kind of presence today that King Ahab was exhibiting. Well, divinely inspired, righteous in his own way, committed to the work of the Lord, Elijah did a phenomenal thing. He actually laid down a challenge. In fact, he actually challenged the prophets of Baal to a great contest, not unlike maybe we would today call it the Super Bowl of prophets, or the prophet of God versus the prophets of Baal. And he did it in a really, really interesting way. He did it really with two major messages, I think, the scriptures tell us about. And that is, one, he was saying to the people, it's time to get off the fence. It's time to make a choice, because you can only serve one master. And we know the scriptures are replete with references to the fact that we can only serve one master. See, the people had not rejected God in total. They had God on a pedestal. They had God as the one who had made the covenant with the nation, and they respected that. But then they also, for added insurance, had added other gods, other idols to that. And we know that's a direct violation of the scriptures. God said, have no other gods before me. And yet for extra insurance, the weak people had added these idols around the one and true God. So they were indecisive. They were not committed. They lacked a full understanding, actually, of what was going on. They were looking for insurance, if you will. Now, Elijah's saying, no decision or being indecisive is a no decision call. So you've got to be active in your faith. You've got to be active in the way that you present yourself before other people. You have to make a choice. Get off the fence. Elijah's sermons were not long. He got right to the point. He said, make up your minds. And the fascinating thing about this is that the people were silent. If you look further down in chapter 18, it basically says that the people who he had been speaking to were just silent. That may be the greatest weakness of mankind. When we don't know what to say because we don't have a commitment or a conviction, we are silent. And sometimes our silence is our worst enemy. And it's also the worst enemy of the people who we might influence for good. So Elijah said to the people these things, make a decision. They're silent. They've shown that they have no courage, no commitment, no faith. And I think today, sometimes when we have the opportunity to represent God before people, we find ourselves guilty in the same way. Well, let's get back to the contest. Let's get back to the Super Bowl. Elijah wanted to make it very clear that everything that happened in this contest was due to the presence of the one and only true and living God. It was not due to any other reason. So he really stacked the deck, as we would say today. But he didn't stack the deck in his favor. He actually stacked the deck in favor of the prophets of Baal. One man, Elijah, against 450 prophets of Baal. Talk about being unequal. That's unequal, but it's a demonstration of faith. He actually let them choose the sacrifice that was to be offered, so they couldn't accuse him of taking the best to offer as a sacrifice. He actually let them go first, which we know today in the sports world may not always be the thing that you want to do, is to have the ball first. What you may want to do is to defer, and he deferred to them. He let them make the choices. See, this contest was on the top of Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel is close to the Mediterranean. It's over 1,800 feet tall in height. And it was a predominant place of worship for all kinds of idols, but particularly for Baal. And archaeological history demonstrates that over and over again, that this was a significant place. But it was not only significant for its presence and for its height and everything, it was significant because it sat on the border between Israel and the really pagan areas north of there. And so it was an indirect way for Elijah and God to say, you're on the fence, you're on the property line here. You have to fall to one side or the other. And not that the falling to Israel was a proper thing because they were embracing this idolatry, but you had to make a choice to honor the original covenant God made with Israel. And so Elijah set it up. He stacked the deck in favor of the prophets of Baal, so that everyone, if God, his God, were to prevail, everyone would know that it was for a very specific reason. So the prophets of Baal got to choose the sacrifice. They got to go first. They took almost all day in appealing to their God, the idol Baal. They started slow, quietly, and during the course of the day, it increased quite a bit. It increased in terms of what they did, in terms of singing and praying and calling on Baal and dancing, and the crescendo just increased throughout the day. And it got more and more unruly as the day went on, and it got louder and louder as the day went on. And finally, it ended with their form of obedience to their idol. They actually performed self-mutilation, and their bodies were covered with blood. They had performed everything they knew of to call on their God to come down and to burn this sacrifice and cause rain to come, because Baal actually was known as the god of storm and thunder, a god that actually had the power to bring rain upon the country. But exhausted near the end of the day, they gave up. So Elijah comes forth, and we see this beginning in verse 31 of chapter 18. Elijah comes forth in a very simplistic, very quick way, actually ask his God, the Almighty, the true and living God, to do exactly the same thing that Baal's prophets have been doing. I think there's a couple of things in here. Elijah built his altar out of 12 stones. It wasn't 10 stones and 2 stones. It wasn't a divided kingdom. Elijah was speaking for the people of Israel with whom God had made the original covenant. It was all inclusive. Elijah wanted to be sure to get that message across. Then he took his stacked deck a step further. He asked for 4 jars of water. And I'm assuming that these jars are these really, really large clay jars that held several gallons of water. One, it was phenomenal that they had water there, to that extent at least, because he asked for 12 jars of water to be poured over his altar and over his sacrifice. Now, I don't know if any of you are challenged like I am sometimes. I have a hard time lighting a gas grill. But certainly I would never attempt to light an altar that would have been saturated and soaked in water. But that's what Elijah did, again, for a very specific reason. So he had this time of preparation, very methodical, very intentional, very message focused for the people to pay attention to. And then he went into his prayer. His prayer was really very, very simple. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. A prayer, 67 words, took less than 30 seconds to say. Now, I know some of you think some of us may still need to adhere to that kind of prayer life, succinct, focused, brief, to the point. Well, Elijah didn't have to raise his voice like the prophets of Baal. He didn't have to carry on. He just made a simple request of God. But because his focus was on the glory of God, he was able to call down the God represented in the fire that burned up the sacrifice, burnt the altar, actually burned the stones. Do you understand how intense that fire must have been? How all-consuming that fire must have been for it to burn 12 stones? If you think that's an easy thing to do, I'm not really serious about this. You might go out in your backyard and try to burn a rock and see how easy that is. It's not a easy thing to accomplish. Well, we know that we know the story. We know that story well, and we know that that God wants us to approach Him today because of Christ's sacrifice for us. Just as He came and responded to Elijah, God responds to us, and He asks us to come into His fold in the same way. Elijah provided the meat sacrifice and the altar. God has provided Christ as the sacrifice for our pathway to access Him. God is always available to us. He's given us the perfect way. Now, the people obviously saw this, as the scriptures tell us. They knew that now they had to make a choice. And probably publicly and in presence of Elijah and presence of God and presence of the prophets of Baal, they chose that God was the one and true and only living God. But could it be sustained? Was it overwhelming? Did it have substance? Was their faith real? Did it have depth to it? Those are the questions that they had to answer, and we'll see that impacts Elijah here in a moment. But it's also the same questions that we have to ask ourselves today. How deep is our faith? We know how deep the Father's love is. How deep is our faith or our love for Him, that we stay committed, that we stay off the fence, and that we stay in His fold? That's a good question. The people of God knew, based upon God's self-revelation, God didn't have to come and burn up the sacrifice. He chose to reveal Himself in the fire. That Yahweh, the Lord, is the only one true God. That reminds us of Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, the Shema, that we've spent some time studying lately. Now, we probably wish that the next part of the story was not there, but what happened? Elijah took all 450 prophets of Baal to the foot of the mountain and slaughtered them. I think there's a lesson in that for us today as well. It's not one we like to think about, but it is one clothed in reality. It's one that we need to pay attention to. And that is, as long as we sit on the fence, as long as we don't make a purposeful choice for God, as long as we don't make that deep, truthful commitment to God, there will be destruction in the final days for those who don't do that. I think it's a sad lesson, and I think there is a reflection in Elijah's time that reflects on the end of time in general. So I think the first real point is in this first part of the lesson, that God moves the hearts of people in various ways to return to Him, or to accept Him initially, and then to stay faithful to Him. I think a second point in this set of scriptures through the first part of chapter 19 is that God provides strength for us no matter our circumstances. You would think after such a great victory, Elijah would have been ecstatic, that he would have been king of the mountain, if you will, that he would have been reflecting God's glory everywhere that he went. But what happens to Elijah? Well, what happened to Elijah is what happens to a lot of us today. Elijah fell into despair, into depression, into doubt. He actually just really, in some regards, gave up. After being such a faithful prophet, he gave up. Elijah had always been in conversation with God. But we find that after he heard the threat from Jezebel, who said, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." One of them is like the prophets of Baal. This was Jezebel's direct threat to Elijah, that she hoped he was dead within 24 hours, like he had done to her prophets. See, Jezebel had a faith. Jezebel had a faith, but what was her faith in? Her faith was in something that had no substance. It had no presence. It had no being. But she was true to what she believed. And so she intimidated Elijah, who's been in conversation with God. How does another human being intimidate another human being who's been talking to God? I don't understand that, but that's exactly what happened. So Elijah lost his perspective. He let the power of his victory slide in his mind, and it didn't increase his faith. In fact, he was more afraid of Jezebel and her faith than he was trusting in the faith of the Lord. See, he had won a war. He had won a battle. He had not won the war. See, winning the war requires persistence. And that's what Elijah had done up until this time. He had a great battle victory, He needed to persistently continue to fight the war, but he gave up. He also lost his vision of God's greatness. He had been fearless before Ahab and before the 450 prophets and before even people who didn't believe in God, but he lost his courage in the face of Jezebel. He lost his vision of God, that God gave him strength. And that's a tradition that we've set. As Tommy did last week, I did this week. So we will learn to manage our phones in a different way. But the point being that Jezebel was more impressive with Elijah than God was. And he lost his commitment to follow God's word. Elijah had always had the conversation with God, as I said, but this time he didn't have a conversation with God. He did not have a conversation with God. He got up in fear and weakness and went south of the kingdom of Judah, if you will, into a desert place. Without asking God, this disappointed man went into self-imposed isolation, but because he believed that Jezebel might have the power to harm him, and that he was weary. He was tired of dealing with people who didn't believe, that he was tired of carrying God's will and nobody paying attention to it. He was tired of all the things that had gone before. And so he gave up on God. And that's not a thing that we ought to do. In fact, he gave up on God so much that he asked God to take his life. He asked God to take his life. Now, for our purposes and for the purposes of the people of Israel, God chose not to honor that. In fact, he never did honor that with Elijah. So we know that the Lord pays attention. When Elijah went into the desert place, he was in deep depression. He thought he was worthless. He thought he had been abandoned for whatever reason. And God knew that in order to deal with Elijah's spiritual weakness, he had to deal with Elijah's physical and emotional weakness first. God didn't come to Elijah in the desert and say, under this bush that he was sleeping under, and say, Elijah, get up. You've forsaken me. You're as bad as the other people. I'm telling you, get back to work. God approached him through two visages of angels, providing for his physical need, giving him sustenance, physical sustenance, a cake baked on stones and water, pure water. And from those two interactions, he also provided something else that Elijah needed. Elijah needed a friend, somebody close by. And so God, in a very tender and merciful sort of way, took care of Elijah's basic needs first, and he would address his spiritual needs later. God told Elijah to go down further into the desert. He actually went down about 230 miles further south into the desert, down to Mount Sinai. Mount Horeb is the way it's written in the scriptures, but it's the same mount where Moses received the law and so many other significant things for the people of Israel had happened. And there God provided physical rest, sleep for his physical body. He provided spiritual rest for his soul, encouragement to him directly to get up and go about the things that God wanted him to do. And he provided companionship for him. The angel provided the companionship for this lonely servant of God. You know, that's one of the things today that we need. I referenced this in an earlier thing that I videoed for the congregation. People need to be around people. People need to be in the presence of other people. It's therapeutic, it's encouraging, it's upbuilding. And so Elijah needed a friend, and God provided an angel to be his companion, to be his friend. That's really what we're talking about today in so many different ways, isn't it? We miss being together in fellowship because fellowship is the essential foundation of the church of God. being together to encourage and uplift each other. That's what we're missing, and that's why we want to be back together soon, but we want to do it in a safe and very practical sort of way. But we miss that presence of being with other people. Elijah, we can relate to him because he was suffering the same thing. He had alienated himself from other people and from God. He thought he was the only true worshiper of God that was left in Israel. And so the third point I think that we can get out of this lesson is that God has a specific way. After he's met the physical and emotional needs of an individual, he also has a way of meeting the spiritual needs of an individual. When we feel like we're alone and in despair, as Elijah did, God has a plan. God didn't say, Elijah, there's a lot of people in Israel still faithful to me. That wasn't the first words out of his mouth. His first words were, I'm giving you another work assignment, Elijah. Get up and go back to work. Even today, we still hear this philosophy pronounced in our society. When people get off track, we often hear people say, well, they need to quit wallowing in self-pity and get back to work. Well, that's what God's saying to Elijah. Elijah, get up. I've got things for you still to do. Yes, the time of your life is at an almost end, but I've still got things for you to do. And so he gave him a chart of things that Elijah was to do still. And then, after Elijah understood what God wanted him to do, God said, you're not alone. He brought to him the presence of other believers in the area where Elijah was to go and to work. God said, I'm sending a prophet to succeed you that will be greater than you. In fact, we see, Tommy will probably talk about this next week, at the beginning of Elisha's ministry. What was the blessing that Elisha asked for from Elijah? God provided this permanent companion for Elijah for the rest of his life on this earth. And so he provided a companion, and then he gave him the reassurance that there were 7,000 believers still in the land of Israel. Elijah wasn't by himself. He just wasn't out among the people to know how much support he had and how many people were there. And isn't that like us today? Sometimes we're not engaged in spreading the word. We're not engaged in teaching other people. We're not engaged in doing benevolence. We're not engaged in so many things the Lord wants us to be engaged in because we think we're all alone. We need to get out in the presence of other people, see the needs, see the people, hear their pleas. And then that brings out the best in us, and we then can bring out the best of God to them. So we see that this particular story ends. God is providing for Elijah by giving him more work, by giving him a permanent companion, and by giving him a reassurance that he is not in this alone. And that takes us back to the fact of Obadiah. Obadiah, very small part of the story back in the beginning. Where do you think those 7,000 people that were still faithful to God in Israel came from? Well, maybe it was from those 100 prophets that Obadiah hid out. Maybe it was from Obadiah himself. Maybe it was from each person that those 100 prophets had taught and brought to God. See, people who minister on behalf of God in small ways can do powerful things to help even the most powerful Christian be more effective. Obadiah protected the prophets who spread the word, who created the mass to support Elijah in his work. I hope there's been something in this that has appealed to you, that has struck a tone in my commitment and your commitment to the way that we live for God. We believe that there is only one true and living God. What we need to do is to act upon that belief with substance, with a faith that's biblical, with a faith that says God walks with us each and every day, as long as we attempt to reflect him properly before other people. Have a great week. Thank you.